Friends and travelers, however you've arrived, I bid you welcome. Here at Let's Be Frank, we're about lives, and above all, living well. But I don't suppose a podcast hosted by Benjamin Franklin could be about anything else. In my lifetime, I pursued the practice of moral improvement like a science, recording my successes, and yes, oftentimes reveling in my failings. It's my hope, with our weekly almanac, to deliver to a curious world delicious morsels of history in quick, easy to digest installments, perfect for a sit in your favorite chair or a morning walk to work. At the end of each installment, I like to wrap it up in a neat little lesson you can apply to your own life, taken from the events, stories, and personalities shared in each episode. So sit back, relax, and together, let's make history. Greetings and salutations, dear listener. Welcome to another installment of Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind with me, your faithful friend and host, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, printer. Follow B. Franklin live across our various social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Like Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind on Facebook. And if you wish to support the history we try to make every day, consider pledging to our Patreon to unlock the varied benefits that comes from being a member of our Junto. My friends, it's been a historic week in 2024, but what was going on in Ben Franklin's world 250 years ago today? The answer to that can be found in this week's edition of This Past Week, a Patreon exclusive piece of content that comes out every week where I revisit a primary source from or associated with Ben Franklin from the week this episode was released. Now, if you've been following the series Franklin on Apple Plus, you'll know that there's a good amount of intrigue that comes from my time in France. Spies loom in the corners of every room, assassins lay in waiting in disguise, and this week's primary source features one such instance from my life, from May 20th of 1778. I receive a curious note from a stranger inviting me to meet them in the garden after dark. The reason behind the meeting they will not disclose, but express in urgency that we must meet and that I must meet alone. To find out what happens in this letter, join our Patreon. With that out of the way, we can get to today's installment. My beloved Junto, it's a difficult thing to exist in the present. Now make no mistake, there are far greater hazards in living in the past, and much more anxiety in living in the future. But existing in the present, particularly in 20 and 24, comes with its own fair share of hardship. Everywhere you turn, there seems to be some emergency, some cause to worry about, some misstep in your own day that you find yourself going over and over again. But every present, whether it is the present of today or the present of mine time, comes with various causes for concern. Some great epidemic that seems out of our control, some emergency that requires our attention, some cause that demands intervention. Everywhere you turn, there seems to be causes worthy of your concern. This week, I sat down with a beloved friend of mine to speak of one such cause from my lifetime. A spirit of hysteria that nearly crippled a country and undid a generation. Now, how many of you, my beloved Junto, will end your days happily with a gin and tonic? It's a restorative, it's a libation, it's a spirit that one might enjoy alone or in good company. Gin becomes synonymous with many a happy memory. But would you believe that at the beginning of its life that was not the case? Today, my friends, we're going to speak of the gin epidemic of London, and we're going to have some help. This past December, I appeared upon another podcast, Hightailing Through History, featuring two sisters who, with recreational repose, travel through history to discuss a variety of topics. I enjoyed being upon their show so much this past December that I invited them to be upon mine. So I hope you'll sit back, relax, and with the co-first lady of Hightailing Through History, enjoy the story of the Gin Craze of London.
So happy to be here. So good to see you again, Dr. Franklin.
Oh, I'm excessively pleased to see you again. It's been far too long. I so enjoyed our conversation when I appeared upon your podcast, which brings us, I think, to the first question. Can you tell the members of our junto how you got involved? And for those who aren't aware of your podcast, talk about your unique salon that you host.
It is a unique salon. Yes, we are hightailing through history. I host it with my sister, and our whole thing is we are two sisters who get high and surprise each other with a story from history's vault of the weird and the wonderful, as we put it. So it allows for a mix of different kinds of history, women's history, weird history, eh, kind of adventurous, mysterious stuff. So we allow it really just kind of gives us an open door to to talking about a lot of different kinds of things, which is nice. We get together and surprise each other with a story and talk about something, and then we discuss it together. And we have guests on, such as yourself, which is really nice to be able to chat with other people and sit together in what we like to call our smoke circle, as which is our community, as we like to call it, and chat history, which we all love so much.
And you know, I've spent some time reflecting on the nature of the relationship you share with your sister, both artistically and personally. Uh, I don't know if you're aware, the first professional vocation of my career was when I was apprenticed to my brother, James. We spent, well, the formative years of my life as I learned to read, as I learned the trade of printing, um, collaborating professionally. And you speak of a lot of highs. I remember a lot of lows with my brother James. And so I admire the relationship you have with your sister, and so admire your endeavor and how you bring history out to the public in a unique way. And speaking of weird history, we are assembled to speak of a well, very weird history that was recent in my time, not so much in yours, and that is the gin epidemic of London. And so I want to get right to it and invite you to talk about what you've discovered, to hear the history as you see it from your time.
So London really loves its gin, and when we think of spirits and when we kind of attach them to locations, sometimes might be like France and Italy, people might think of wine and champagne, and in England maybe beer might come up, but in London gin was the thing. It was the spirit, and it really made quite the scene in the 18th century. But there was a time when it did become such a problem that maybe London liked its gin a little bit too much, and some of the population were drinking themselves quite literally to death. So I always like to refer to, whenever I'm relaying a portion of history, I like to refer to the historical tapestry to give context and background on whence everything is happening. Because history doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's usually a series of events that make one thing lead to another and get different people involved in certain ways. And so it wasn't like every one day everybody just woke up and they were smashed on gin. And alcohol is not new to humanity. We've had beer and wine for millennia, but spirits are relatively new at this time period. Historians know that spirits were drunk for pleasure as far back as 1500 CE, because we have records that King James IV of Scotland had several barrels of whiskey. But he's a king. He has lots of money to spend on spirits and being able to drink something like this for fun, for pleasure. Whereas for us peasants, the spirits came in a medicinal form. But at the end of the 17th century and going into the 18th, there are some big changes for England, specifically for the city of London. In 1688, England gets a Dutch king on the throne, and his name is William III of Orange, which is great. Checks out. Dutch king, Orange, William III of Orange. And it's part of what's called in history the Glorious Revolution. So in case anyone's really interested in understanding more of how a Dutch king gets on the English throne, it's the Glorious Revolution. So for our modern day listeners, they can Google that.
And so a fascinating amount of things come from the Glorious Revolution. We get the writings of John Locke. We get the notion that kings don't rule by divine right, but rather instead by consent of the governed. And apparently, if I'm following the line of where you're going, a new spirit arises in addition to this spirit of liberty.
Absolutely. And of course there's, a lot to these sorts of things as they happen, but at this particular moment in time that William III becomes the king of England, the Dutch and the French are at war with each other. They're big old enemies, and because of this, William III bans the import of French wines and spirits and encourages the distillation of spirits from homegrown grains within England. Now, of course, like I said, there's a little bit more to this in terms of the taxes. So there's the, importing and taxes and costs and profit margins and all these things that are happening. But when we distill it down, whammy, we get gin, which is a Dutch invention. And also, as it's in England, there's no established social rules in terms of how you drink gin and when you drink gin and how much of it that you drink. So it's hitting an English market, and it's attracting a lot of small distillers to the scene. And I like to mention the no social rules portion of it, because previously beer and ale houses were for the boys, were for men. That was, women might drink beer, might imbibe in it occasionally, but it was specifically more of the alehouse was a men's place and for men to drink beer. And also beer comes in pints. But now we have gin, as spirits in general, but gin specifically, hitting the scene, and it's new and no one knows quite, what to do with it. And because beer was drunk in pints and still is to this day, they were like, do we just continue using our pint glasses for gin? So, so I think that's something that's really important to point out, that it wasn't people like, yay, this is a new thing and I can get really, really drunk on this. It's more if we just don't know exactly how to drink it. And the gin is twice as strong then as it is today in my time. So
I beg your pardon?
Yikes.
So not only were they drinking this very dangerous beverage in excess in higher quantities, but it was a stronger and more potent distillation than what is regulated in your time.
Yes, indeed. So
how if I may ask, how bad did it get?
Well, yes, I think I think that's the question of the day, right? Is it's there is certainly. I also do want to point out there was, as we go through this, there's a little bit of a moral panic around it too. So there's some things that I feel for me in my time looking back at this, there are some things I come across where I had to kind of pick apart, is this moral panic and maybe like anti-gin propaganda, if you will, quote unquote, around this topic, or was this really that bad? And in addition to gin hitting the scene at the same time period, that turn of the 18th century, London, even though it is an ancient port city that's been around since, like Roman Londinium times, we go back a long way with London. At this time period, the turn of the 18th century, it gets a huge period of urbanization. And so the early 18th century, the population's at 600,000 people. People coming from smaller towns are getting this taste of anonymity in a big city. And so it's kind of this feeling of like, hey, we can drink this gin and have some fun, and we don't have everyone in our business like we do in a small town. so the gin drinking is growing and continuing. It gets to the point where the Gin Act of 1736 makes this draconian attempt at reining in the chaos of all these distillers making so much gin. And not even all the ingredients are that safe in the gin too. So when you have a lot of ingredients that you're putting in your pot here, we have a lot of gin on the market and not all of it is safe. And so this Gin Act of 1736 attempts to cut down on the amount of distillers, and it taxes the absolute dickens out of distilled spirits and makes the sale of gin in quantities under 2 gallons illegal. Now, in addition to that, distillers had to pay an annual license fee of £50, which translated to my present day money in 2024 in US dollars is over $15,300 or 9,000 pounds in 2024. That's a huge amount of money to have an annual license to pay annually for that amount of money. And so this effectively put a lot of distillers out of business and also simultaneously drove the sale of gin underground. Now, in our history of America in the early 20th century, there's prohibition, and there are a lot of parallels with America's prohibition and what happens with the gin craze in London in terms of more taxation, more laws, prohibition in America of alcohol, and then there's the underground, and like bootleggers, if you will. So, due to it going underground, people just weren't paying the taxes, so the government gets paid informants to out these unlicensed gin sellers, which becomes a problem for both sides. So you have angry gin-loving mobs who would attack, and there were even some records of people being beat to death of suspected informants. Conversely, there were a lot of unscrupulous informants who just ran the whole thing as a sort of blackmail or extortion scheme, like a pay me or else I'm turning you in. So it was not good having these informants on the scene. And when people go underground, they get creative with the ways that they hide their wrongdoing, which personally, I love to hear these sorts of things, these sorts of stories. So enter a mechanical cat stage left. It was called the Puss machine, and its concept is pretty simple concept. It's basically a vending machine for gin. A gin seller would find a window that was nowhere near the building's front door, so it was just tucked down a little alleyway somewhere. And the window would be boarded up, and then it would also be boarded up with the wooden cat design on the front of it. And the cat, which was not a cute depiction of a cat, its mouth was kind of like, kind of snarly and open, and it had its little paw up, and underneath the paw would be a lead spout. The person that would want to buy the gin would come up to the boarded window and say, "Puss, give me 2 penny worth of gin." They put their coins in the cat's mouth. It would slide down to the gin seller on the other side of the boarded window, and then they would pour 2 penny worth of gin down the spout. They hold it in their little cup. Brilliant. And it's this lovely little loophole with the gin laws, because at the time, you had to witness the entire transaction. You had to be able to see both sides. And along with that, an informant, if they had happened to witness the gin selling happen, if they're witnessing gin going in a cup, they don't have the authority to go inside the building to catch the seller on the other side. So all they could do is just witness one side of the transaction, and no charges could be brought against the seller or anybody because the full transaction couldn't be witnessed. So it was this really great loophole with these Puss machines, which would be just kind of dotted around the city. They weren't abundant necessarily, but there were enough of them where you could find them close enough. And its creator, Dudley Bradstreet, made 2 to 4 pounds British sterling, a day, sitting behind his Puss machine, which is an amazing amount of money to earn per day. In American dollars in 2024, it would be about $1,000 a day, 900 to 1,000.
Never let it be said that adversity doesn't breed innovation. That's fascinating. I've heard of the Puss in Mew, but I've never heard it described in those mechanics. You've painted a wonderful, or maybe I should say horrific, picture of it, but also a fascinating description of the legal loophole as well. So do we see this pattern repeating in history? It all sounds fairly familiar. The substance changes, the names change, the loopholes change, but it reminds me of several instances in the course of history where some new epidemic strikes and people, prior to regulation, find ways around to and make a penny, a pound,
Yeah,
or a dollar
when I was
off
going
of
through
it.
this, I did find a lot of parallels to America's alcohol prohibition. But as you said, this could apply to so many other things. You know, whatever is getting regulated or prohibited or is seen as the vice to keep an eye on. That seems to be the repetition throughout history with things of this nature. And yeah, the unfortunately, I mean, with that continued underground market and black market of gin, the crime rates increased, and it caused a lot of problems for people. Just alcoholism in general, you know, being a major problem, of course, but how that affects the family, how that affects the health of the people and the population. And there were accounts of people selling the clothes off their back to buy gin. And it's worth noting that we're not quite in the historical timeline that we have gotten to textile machines. So the clothing that you had was the clothing you had. You couldn't just, you know, have it made on a machine again so easily. And along with that, as I mentioned some moral panic earlier, there was a new wave of anti-gin and anti-drinking battle cries that came up during this time period. And they get especially loud after that gin tax of 1736, where everything goes underground. By the time we get to 1751, we have William Hogarth's Gin Lane engraving, which is a very popular. I think probably once people see it, they go, "Oh, I've seen that one before." It's depicting just how bad things were at the time for those in this gin craze of London. Depicting the ruin of people, the death, the families breaking apart, how it was hurting people in their jobs, like people were selling their tools and things like that. So this is being reflected in this engraving in 1751. And at that same year that engraving was released, the government passed a second Gin Act of 1751, which then forced distillers to only sell the licensed retailers. So now there's no more gin that can just be sold to grocers and apothecaries, the barber, the tobacconist. You can't just go into any old store and buy your gin now, or especially with the Puss and Mew machine now. And that is what started to quell that gin craze. And now these days, for us at least, in my time period, these days gin is treated just like any other form of alcohol. It has its taxes and it has its settings, the locations in which it could be bought, and who it can be sold to, and who can drink it and who can't, you know, that kind of stuff. Distillers can't add poisonous ingredients to it just to add a little extra pizzazz to the taste. It now has really like its own unwritten but socially acceptable rules that are attached to it. So, but that wasn't the case in 18th century London when they were having a gin craze. But there's the history of that little snippet of time.
Incredible. Laurel, thank you for that history lesson. You know, I'm quoted often in your time. I'm misquoted just as often in your time. One quote that's come to mind that I said is, "Wine is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy." On the same vein, I think gin is proof that God sometimes likes to shake things up and challenge us, whether that's in my time or in yours. Now, one last question that I ask of all of our friends and guests on this show is, what is it about studying history that sets you on fire?
Oh, wow. I think it's something I became very passionate about when I was little. Just, I think it's hearing the different stories. I guess it's in the name, right? History. The story that is history, and we have such a huge timeline of history that we can dive into and explore, and all different historical actors and places in the world that I feel can really speak to us as individuals. I think sometimes there's a certain person that somebody learns about, or a culture or a period in time that we as history lovers learn about and absolutely fall in love with. And I feel like that just kicks the doors down to really dive headfirst into the world of history and to learn more and see, not only seeing ourselves in these stories, but also seeing our own culture and our society and our own current history being paralleled or reflected back in history, which I think is all of what makes the importance of studying history that much more pertinent when we see these sorts of things happening. But oh man, I just to learn something new about somebody or something in history, I feel like is just such a wonderful use of my time, really. You're like, what can I do today? I'm going to learn about something in history because I just think it just really lights me up. I like the way that you say it sets you on fire because that's how it feels. Yeah.
Well, isn't that how we make history? Doing something with our time. So thank you for coming on the show today and giving us the gift of learning something. Now, if our listeners do wish to find you, can you list some places that they can find you, listen to your show?
Yeah, so social media wise, we are on Instagram. We're probably the most active there on Instagram at Hightailing History, or on TikTok, we're Hightailing History Pod. So those are our two social media accounts. But in terms of the podcast itself, we are on YouTube, Hightailing Through History, and then we're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, Samsung, basically wherever you get your favorite podcast, wherever you listen to Let's Be Frank, really.
Perfect. Well, Laurel, thank you so much for joining us. I'm certain we'll be in touch soon on this platform or yours.
Sounds wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, what lesson can we derive from today's installment? In every lifetime, there are problems that seem out of hand, out of our control. Problems that without intervention will cause nothing but calamity and concern. The lesson for today's installment is to look at these great challenges and crucibles not with despair, but instead with an ardent fury to be that change. The lesson for today's installment, my beloved Junto, is to affix your signature and your voice to the causes that matter. To look to the challenges of today not with concern, but rather with the ardent fire to do something about it. The lesson for today's installment, my beloved Junto, is to make the impossible challenges of today the triumphant history of tomorrow. That's all for today's installment. Would that we had more hours in the day, but as always, we have nothing but time between us. Resource materials and images from this week's episode can be found in the journal of bfranklinlive.com. If you like the show, subscribe and stay up to date with all the latest gossip. And do me the kindness of leaving a review. You can find the link to our Patreon in our show notes, as well as links for our Venmo for one-time donations. Support the history we try to make so that we can keep telling stories in funny clothes. And my dear friends, spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbor, tell your horse, I don't care. Let's make our intellectual junto grow. And now, my friends, our time together has come to an end. Fare thee well. And always remember, when you are good to others, you are best to yourselves. Until we meet again, I remain your humble and obedient servant, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, Printer. Stay curious, my friends.